Welcome back to the Lydia Miguru channel and to my series on editorial fatigue. You can watch the earlier videos in this series to kind of get caught up. I don't want to do too much recapping. Today I'm going to be examining what Mark Goodacre says about the story of the beheading of John the Baptist as told in both Mark and Matthew. This is a case where Goodacre thinks Matthew is based on Mark, and he thinks that editorial fatigue shows this, that Matthew makes some changes that he is then, quote unquote, unable to sustain. I'm going to start with a rather trivial change that Goodacre alleges, and I'm going to say, yes, maybe, but this is not a factual change. This is just a terminological change that maybe Matthew did make. But I don't think that it should be called editorial fatigue anyway, because I don't think it was a big, huge deal to Matthew that he was trying to change or trying to maintain and then accidentally not maintaining. This concerns the fact that in the early reference to Antipas, Herod Antipas, in his story of the beheading of John the Baptist, Matthew calls him Herod the Tetrarch, which was technically his correct name. John Mark calls him the king in more than one place in that same passage. Now, I strongly suspect that king would have been a term that even if it was not technically correct, people would sometimes use. And I think Mark, as a first century source, is something that we ought to consider there as an example of usage. Interestingly, later in the same passage, Matthew just calls him the king. And Mark Goodacre takes this to mean that Matthew has become fatigued and isn't sustaining his attempt to change the terminology and make it more correct. I was reading an interesting article on a blog this week that claimed, I have not been able to check this out, but that claimed that in Josephus, we never find a person being referred to as just the Tetrarch with no name. So in other words, you might say Herod the Tetrarch, okay? Or Archelaus the Tetrarch or something like that, but not just so-and-so and then later the Tetrarch. So that for Matthew to just use the king might have been a more common usage when the name wasn't going to be given. I'm not going to insist on that. What I am going to say is, maybe Matthew changed it early on, but I don't think it was a really big deal to him, and I don't think we need to think of him as growing fatigued toward the end. And in any event, it's not a factual change. Even in our own culture, we have things like people might refer to a court decision as a law. Now, I'm a bit of a geek about things like that, and I'll jump on it and say that court precedent is not a law. Court rulings are not laws, but that's because I'm picky about it, But in usage, in popular usage, people might call a given ruling a law. And I would suspect that Mark provides evidence for us of something similar when it comes to referring to Antipas occasionally as the king, in which case Matthew wouldn't have necessarily tried super hard to change it in both places. Let's set that one aside. Goodacre and I are for once agreed that that's not very important. Okay, and so now I want to read what Goodacre says about something that really would be, if he were right, a factual change. This is Goodacre. Styler points further to a more serious inconsistency in the same verse. The story in Mark is that Herodias wanted to kill John because she had a grudge against him. And then he quotes Mark 6:19-20, but she could not because Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. All right, so that's Mark. In Matthew's version of the story, continues Goodacre, this element has dropped out. Now it is Herod and not Herodias who wants him killed. Now, I just want to pause right there, and he refers to Matthew 14:5. Matthew never says, and not Herodias. This is something you find in New Testament scholars with some frequency, that they'll just sort of slip in there the implication that a gospel author is denying something because the gospel author doesn't say that. We'll see this later in Goodacre, where he's talking about the man Jesus healed who had to be let down through the roof. And Goodacre says that in Luke, Jesus has not entered the house. But there's nothing in Luke that says that Jesus hasn't entered the house. It's just that Luke only later, a little bit later, okay, implies that Jesus is in a house. Like, he doesn't right up front say, oh, and by the way, he was in a house. It becomes clear as it goes on. But, he's in they have to lift up the roof of a house that Jesus has not entered in Luke. What do you mean Jesus has not entered it in Luke? He just told you that he was in a house. So it's similar here. It's not true that in Matthew's version, it is Herod and not Herodias who wants him killed. Just watch for that. All right, to continue with Goodacre. When Mark then speaks of Herod's grief at the request for John's head, it is coherent and understandable. Herodias demanded something that Herod did not want. But when Matthew in parallel speaks of the king's grief, Matthew 14:9, it makes no sense at all. Matthew had told us, after all, that Herod wanted to put him to death, and he's there quoting from Matthew 14:5. The obvious explanation for the inconsistencies of Matthew's account is that he is working from a source. He has made changes in the early stages which he fails to sustain throughout, thus betraying his knowledge of Mark. Now, this is a vast overstatement of the case, which betrays a real lack of psychological nuance on the part of Goodacre. The overstatement begins with what I just noted. It is Herod and not Herodias. It says that Herod wanted to kill him. It didn't say Herodias didn't. All right. But let's notice some rather interesting agreements between Matthew and Mark that are relevant to this question of Herod's motive. In both Matthew and Mark, and in very similar wording, I'm not denying that Matthew may have been using Mark to some extent, though not exclusively, as a source, Herod arrests John. And it doesn't say in Matthew that, Herod is forced to arrest John by his wife Herodias. It just says he goes out and he arrests them. All right? I should say Mark doesn't say that he only arrested him because Herodias made him do it. So Mark is the one whom Goodacre is portraying as being consistent, that Herod didn't want to kill John, and was only forced to do so by Herodias and so forth. But Mark says that he arrested him and doesn't say anything about Herodias, forcing him to arrest him. So there's an agreement there that they both agree that Herod went out and arrested him. And of course, they both agree that John the Baptist was being very, very critical of Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas can't have been very pleased about that. So, let's not make it out like, in Mark, Herod Antipas is deep good friends with John the Baptist, okay? John is criticizing a very powerful and not very good ruler. All right, now, we find also in both of them that Herod Antipas is superstitious. So they both say that Herod Antipas thinks that Jesus is John the Baptist risen from the dead. All right, this is kind of superstitious, and I think it betrays a guilty conscience, okay? So even though Matthew says that Antipas wanted to kill him, nonetheless, even earlier than that in the passage, he shows Antipas portraying a guilty conscience. So in Matthew, we have something early in the passage where Antipas doesn't feel so good about having beheaded John, and therefore he has this superstitious suspicion that Jesus might be John the Baptist risen from the dead. And over in Mark, we have, as well as in Matthew, Antipas arresting John. So even though Antipas protects him from being killed at first, as Mark describes it. Still, he was quite happy to arrest him. Or maybe I shouldn't say quite happy, but at any rate, went out there and arrested him with no indication that someone else forced him to it. So there are agreements here that have to do with the way that Antipas thought and the way that he acted. Now, Matthew only mentions that Herod Antipas feared the multitude because they thought that John the Baptist was a holy man. Mark mentions that Herod Antipas feared John the Baptist himself because he, Antipas, knew that John the Baptist was a holy man. But these, of course, are completely compatible, completely consistent with one another. Okay? Mark shows that Antipas treats him sort of like a religious curiosity. He says he's perplexed, but he enjoyed listening to him, so he'd call him and, hey, come talk to me, come tell me what a bastard I am because I, married my brother's wife, However it went, the point is he's a kind of entertaining curiosity to Antipas. This reminds us a little bit of Jesus, where Antipas was hoping Jesus would perform a miracle for him. You may remember that's mentioned in Luke. Now, according to Mark, he's afraid that something bad might happen to him if he killed a righteous man. But we can well imagine that Herod fears John the Baptist himself and also fears the people, as mentioned in Matthew. Why not? All right, here's John the Baptist. He obviously is a brave and honest and righteous, prophetic sort of person, and that wins him respect from the people. It also wins him a kind of fearing respect from Herod. And so Herod's thinking, the people are going to be mad at me if I kill him, and also maybe something bad will happen to me if I kill him because he is a righteous man. So again, completely compatible. He protects him for a while from Herodias, like, nah, we better not kill him, for mixed motives, but then gives in. All right. And in his own heart, even while he was protecting him, as mentioned in Mark, he could also dislike him. Wicked, powerful men have often felt these kinds of mixed feelings. When someone is having the bravery to come out and criticize them boldly, they half respect them, half fear them, are somewhat entertained by them, yet also feel enmity and even hatred against them in their hearts. Who do you think you are to tell me who I can marry and who I can't marry? Funny little man, you don't even seem afraid of me, etc., etc. Okay? It's a very believable portrait. Very credible portrait. Goodacre's wooden literalism, if I may use that word, does not allow for a variety of motives within one real historical person, Herod Antipas. It's got to be one or the other. It's either Herod who wanted to kill him or Herodias who wanted to kill him. It's either, he either feared John or he feared the people. It's, can't be both. Why not? People are like that. Now, later on, Goodacre talks about the fact that both of them mention that the king was sorry after his stepdaughter danced. He's promised to give her what she wants. Her mother says, ask for John the Baptist's head. And it says that Herod's sorry. It says that in both. And so, Goodacre says, this makes no sense at all. Why not? If Herod, like many complicated human beings, has motives on both sides, it said right in Matthew that he was afraid of the multitude. So if he's still afraid of the multitude, even just write in Matthew that problem with killing John the Baptist has not been addressed. And he's sorry, like, oh no, I gotta kill him, and maybe I'll get in trouble with the multitude. Okay, and then his sorrow also fits with what was mentioned at the beginning in Matthew, which is that he later feels uncomfortable about this. And then that fits with what's mentioned over in Mark, which is that he feared John. He actually feared John the Baptist because he was a holy man. All makes perfectly good sense. Contra Goodacre, who says it makes no sense at all. One more point, a linguistic point. Now remember, Goodacre has said that when an author experiences fatigue, he falls into docile reproduction of his source. And then that betrays his source. Okay? But what we find is that when this word for sorry comes up, this point where it says Herod was sorry, they actually use two different Greek words. Now, I'm not making a big deal out of that, but it should be a big deal for Goodacre's theory. Because according to Goodacre, it's just at this point that Matthew's just sort of copying Mark in a rote, docile, passive fashion and forgetting that he was trying to make Herod want to kill John the Baptist, that he was changing the motive. Then why didn't he use the same word that Mark used, if this is where he's falling into docile reproduction? We saw something like that in the parable of the servants that we discussed before. And also, once again, Goodacre is picturing something as being important to Matthew to change quite deliberately and factually, namely the motive involved, and that Herod wants to kill him in Matthew, and that's changed from Mark. But Goodacre holds that Matthew just forgets within only a few verses this factual change that he's trying to make. It's from Matthew 14:5 to Matthew 14:9 that this change would occur. That's a really quick onset, sudden fatigue onset syndrome that Matthew is apparently suffering from. We'll see even more sudden fatigue onset syndrome in later examples where the person becomes fatigued in the very next verse after he supposedly made this change. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So again, what we see is that this isn't some kind of insight that the experts have, that those of us who are not experts just are not in a position to criticize. We can actually dig in and we can say, no, wait a minute, it didn't say that. You're adding something there. It didn't say that Herodias didn't want to kill him, Herod instead of Herodias, and why couldn't Herod have wanted to kill him, but also been afraid of the people and also been afraid of John the Baptist, and so kind of waffling back and forth? All of that is very believable. We can do that from within our knowledge and experience of human nature, history, and so forth, rather than just saying, well, he's a New Testament scholar and he's got all this Greek knowledge and so on and so on. Who am I? That's why when people ask me that kind of question about credentials and qualifications, I want to challenge them to delve into some of these examples and to see for themselves that that's not really what it's all about. It's instead about an over-readiness to accept overcomplicated theories of factual change. So I hope you'll come back next time. I think we'll be talking about that healing miracle with the lame man who had to be let down through the roof next time, here on the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.